So in our previous examples, we saw what we could do with the flexbox just by using the flex property. So we had the rows in our first example, and we saw that with the bird gallery. Next, we saw what we could do in the Lighthouse Bistro example with the order 1, 2, and 3, and then our flex property, which remember is a total of 10 for 100% of the width of our viewport, or at least the width of our container. In this particular example, this one is 8.3, and again, this is in the student files. This is in the 8.3 folder, and this is a.html. We have the idea of grid template columns and grid template rows. What we're doing is we are creating a set of columns. So the columns go up and down, just like columns that hold up a building, and the rows go left to right, just like when you are rowing a boat. That is the way in which your oars are moving. I know it's weird for me to have to verbalize that, but for some people it's hard to visualize. So there's a visual cue. So what we've got here is grid template columns and grid template rows, and those are on lines 11 and 12. So you'll notice here in my live preview that if I adjust the size of my viewport, that I have 4 columns of birds, no matter how wide I am making this viewport. That's because what I have here on line number 11, grid template columns, is telling me repeat for 4 columns, a width of 200 pixels. So if I change this, let's do 3, and instead of 200 pixels, we'll make it a little bit wider. We'll go to 250 pixels. So you'll notice it's a little bit wider. I have 3 columns across, and they are 250 pixels. So if I change this repeat to 2 and save it again, you'll notice I get that change instantly. I have 2 columns, and my next property there is grid template rows. You'll notice that's to auto. It doesn't matter how many rows we have, so those go across as long as we're fulfilling how many columns we have. So I'll put this back to 4. I will put this back to 200 pixels so we can see the way that that was meant to be in the first place. But because this is our flex grid, notice what happens as we really shrink the size of our viewport here. Not anything satisfactory, right? I have to scroll left and right. Why do I have to scroll left and right when in my previous example with my flex grid, I didn't have to do that? The viewport, so the size of your browser, determined how many images I could see. Well, this time I'm saying grid template columns in line number 11. I am telling the browser that my gallery ID has 4 columns. Each of those columns is 200 pixels wide. Each one of those columns also gets what you see on line number 13, that grid gap. So that's what you're seeing, that 2EM in between all of my images. So this time around, I've taken that, that property of, I believe it was margin of 2EM from our very first example in 8.1. And this time around, I made that grid gap the property there, which essentially does exactly the same thing. So here, remember, these are parallel. They're not used together. So this is another different way to do what we saw in 8.1. We can use our grid template. So the grid template, we can say we have so and so many columns and we have so and so many rows. And that is how we would do this. Could I essentially copy this, repeat for 200 pixels and do that in rows? I could. I would need more images to be able to get this particular thing to work, because now I have 4 columns and 4 rows. I would need a total of 16 images to make this look proper. But we could enforce that change. So I'm going to go ahead and reset those to where they were supposed to be, just like so. So that you can see we can enforce the size of an element, even if that enforcement makes it so that when I change the size of my viewport, I am enforcing a rule that is going to enforce a consequence. It doesn't matter the size of my viewport. I am still enforcing 4 columns across.